I'm absolutely certain in my own mind that one of the clear objectives of Hamas last weekend was to try and disrupt those improved relations between Israel and the UAE, I think Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, other major, the relative stability of the relations with Egypt at the moment.
I think, first of all, in terms of this evacuation of northern Gaza, we had Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, on this programme earlier, who was highlighting that the fact there is a warning is something that sets Israel apart from Hamas in this sort of context, in that if indeed there is going to be some sort of incursion, some sort of ground operation, that at least there is a warning coming. However, Nikki, we put that up against the UN saying, well, hang on a second, 1 million people can't possibly move in the next 24 hours. So this warning is pretty meaningless. And I suppose that really highlights the real difficulty with this conflict in some ways.
Well, it does, doesn't it? And what an extraordinary week it has been to watch what's happened and will continue to happen. I mean, the fact is, Grant is right, which is that Israel has given a warning. There was absolutely no warning last Saturday. And I know you were also interviewing earlier one of the people caught up in the fighting the terrorists infiltrating their kibbutz. And the terror that has caused. I understand the UN's position, their need to warn, but at the end of the day, these are terrorists. And I think the Israelis, I am firmly of the opinion, the Israelis have the right absolutely to defend themselves and their people.
Yeah. Just on the UN point, Jack, with what Nikki said in mind, Emma texts to say the UN has no power and, in my view, no backbone. This is a lost cause. The Hamas terrorists have set a trap for Israel. Too many innocent Israeli and Palestinians are being killed as a direct result of Hamas's actions. And this person doesn't leave their name but says the UN Security Council will meet today. It will achieve nothing, but it will probably be followed by a nice lunch in New York, which does outline part of the feeling of frustration with the UN.
Well, the major problem with the structure of the United Nations as we end the first quarter of the 21st century is that it was designed for the second half of the 20th century. And the major powers in the United Nations are those who were the victors, if you like, in the Second World War. And the world looks very different today, particularly with the role of Russia and China generally in opposing international action to protect civilians. And I think to some extent, if we're being comprehensive here, the role that America has played sometimes in the past in relation to the situation in the Middle East, although I do hope this week, and I think the signals are this might be the case, that the US Secretary of State has been urging, at least behind the scenes, restraint and humanitarian principles with the Israeli government. And I think that's really important. I am absolutely at one with Nikki on the right of Israel to defend itself, the absolute need to deal with Hamas, a brutal, horrific organization that no one should defend. But killing more babies in Palestine is not an appropriate response to the horrific killing of babies in Israel last weekend. So I think this attempt at a warning needs to go a bit further. There needs to be humanitarian access. There needs to be, I think, time given for those who are disabled or in hospital recovering from the bombings that have already taken place to get out of the area. And, 24 hours is not going to work for that. I hope the timetable is not being driven by the need to do something within 7 days of the previous action. I think it would be appropriate to make sure that those civilians who are willing to move, who need to move, but who will struggle to move, have enough time to do so.
I just wonder, Nikki, about what everyone's really concerned about here is the danger of escalation. And when we just think about all of the countries surrounding in the region and the big players, I mean, Jack mentioned there, you've got Russia, you've got China, we also know the US, UK. How can those countries, with all of their different interests, navigate this to try and stop an escalation? We've covered this story, the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine for so many years. It always feels like there's just not a lot of hope surrounding it.
Yes, I think that is how many people feel. So I last visited Israel in 2018 and met people, both Israelis and Palestinians, and went into the West Bank as well as having conversations with senior members of the Israeli government at the time. And it is true, I think, that you often come away. I mean, it's a fantastic part of the world, but it's also you come away thinking, how is this ever going to be solved? The differences are so deeply entrenched. But I think the one thing I'd hope that all countries can agree on is the need to avoid that escalation, whilst also respecting the right of self-defense, as we've talked about. But of course, and I think in the Times today it reports that there was a very unusual conversation between the leaders of Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. Obviously, President Putin has spoken out on this. There are countries like Egypt and Qatar and Turkey who may well, they're inevitably doing things behind the scenes, but they absolutely have a point. And in listening to that text from the person texting about the UN Security Council, I hear the point, but equally, if those countries have got to get round the table and talk, that has got to be better than not talking. So I think everyone will desire to try to stop this escalating and to try to stop neighbouring countries being drawn in any way. Egypt have a very important role to play in keeping crossings with Gaza open and facilitating the aid getting in. It'll be very slow, and I think it's going to be extremely unstable for quite some time to come. And the danger, of course, is that there's lots of other instability around the world, and that the world's attention inevitably is diverted to this horrendous situation and away from other conflicts and differences that are ruining people's lives, but also need, and I think particularly of Ukraine, but there'll be other situations as well that also need continuing attention.
Jack, I just wonder who has leverage in that region to try and broker any sense of a ceasefire. There's just so many, as Nikki says, deeply entrenched views and people who have long-standing commitments to either side. You just wonder who that is or which country that is that can kind of navigate it.
Well, I listened to Mark Lyle Grant earlier in your programme, and he's very wise and experienced former diplomat and always worth listening to. He's absolutely right. Egypt, Qatar and Turkey are the most significant players in the region. The recent history in relation to Turkey in particular is not necessarily encouraging. It's quite clear that Turkey have not been behind efforts to hold Daesh, ISIS accountable for their attempted genocide of the Yazidis and other horrific crimes in the region. But I think it's essential to try and engage with them. I think there needs to be some kind of serious international diplomatic pressure on Qatar, who I think are far too close to some of these groups while being active on the global stage. Those two things are incompatible in my view. And I think to me, probably the most important strategic thing here, apart from giving a very clear signal that what happened last weekend was utterly unacceptable and that Israel must defend itself against that sort of massacre. I think the other thing is that the recent improvement in relations between Israel and a number of states in the Middle East region must not be derailed by this situation. I'm absolutely certain in my own mind that one of the clear objectives of Hamas last weekend was to try and disrupt those improved relations between Israel and the UAE, I think Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, other major, the relative stability of the relations with Egypt at the moment. And I do not think they should be allowed a victory here in damaging those relations in terms of the way in which the Israelis react and the way that other countries then react to that. So I don't know how difficult it is. I'm not at the centre of this. I can't really comment on what discussions might be taking place behind the scenes. But I do think if there's any way of continuing dialogue and some sort of collaboration across the region here, then that should be a primary objective of Israel and their allies.
Just want to read this message from Megan, who's got in touch to say, how exactly should Israel exercise its right to defend herself? She can't fire rockets at Hamas targets because Hamas hides behind civilians. Thus, they claim those civilian deaths are Israel's fault. Israel can't ask the civilians to move because that creates a crisis. Again, unnecessary if Hamas would stop embedding amongst civilians. Not to mention that the cowardly Hamas fighters target civilians rather than warning them. So in theory, your guests say Israel has the right to defend herself, but they refuse to allow any practice to do so. Why are the civilian deaths on both sides not laid at the feet of Hamas? They could stop the blockade by releasing the innocent civilians they hold. From Megan in the West Midlands, which is just a sort of interesting thought as part of this discussion.
Chris has also got in touch saying it's all very well talking about sending aid and evacuation for Gaza, but how do you differentiate between civilians and Hamas terrorists?
One of the other things I just wanted to put to both of you, just as another consideration, but just by way of the kind of international response to all of this, news from France that they banned pro-Palestinian protests. I mean, it was flouted immediately in the face of that ban. But then also alongside that, Rishi Sunak has urged police chiefs here in the UK to bring, quote, the full force of the law to bear against protesters who committed hate crimes and supported Hamas. I mean, there's a slight difference, I suppose, to consider here between pro-Palestinian and those who support Hamas, but I'm just wondering about just the sort of principle, Nikki, of banning protests as France pursued in the last sort of 24 hours or so.
Well, I can understand why they would attempt to do that, but I think having done that, then 3,000 protesters waving pro-Palestinian flags or Palestinian flags then went out on the street, so it was not successful. It's an understandable immediate response, but I think long term it's not going to work and probably ends up causing further problems. I suppose the issue, what the Prime Minister will be trying to achieve here with the police chiefs, is how do you make sure that protest free speech up to a point obviously is permitted, but doesn't inflame the situation and make the Jewish population, the Israeli population living in London, feel any less safe than they already do, for example. So it's very difficult, and I think we've got the situation, haven't we, with sports matches and others, where people are being asked to do things to show support, which and none of this. I mean, the fact that I think that probably Jack and I are talking, but everyone's picking their way through this very carefully. It's a difficult situation, and people really don't want to make it any worse than it already is, if that's possible, given the horrificness of what's been reported today.
Yeah, of course. Jack, just a thought from you as well on that then, the ban in France and Rishi Sunak's response in terms of cracking down.
Well, first, can I just say, first of all, in relation to the text from Megan,
Sure.
I hope everybody who's commenting on this this weekend is thinking about the complexity of the situation, and I hope that they are, whether it's Nikki and I today or anybody else on any other programme, thinking carefully about the difficulty in pursuing Hamas and the way that Hamas will use civilians in the Gaza Strip to hide behind. The fact that they do that, and that does make them responsible for what happens to those civilians, does not make it acceptable to conduct any indiscriminate bombing or killing of Palestinians. So I don't underestimate the difficulty the Israelis have here, but I do think anybody speaking out anywhere in the world today needs to be careful to make sure that action is not indiscriminate, and that as much is done as possible to protect any innocent civilians. On the situation in the UK, I actually think all this is really quite clear. I support the right to free speech and to protest, but I think any attempt to, and I will condemn those I disagree with, I don't believe in silencing them. I think those on the left in particular who try and associate the activities of Hamas with, for example, the long-running campaign against apartheid by the ANC in South Africa. The ANC never slaughtered babies in their beds. So don't make that equivalence, because it's just not true. But at the same time, I do support people's right to express their opinions. What they should not be allowed to do is intimidate anybody else, and that goes on both sides. Violence and intimidation is not acceptable in any society. Doesn't matter what the cause is, and I think that in the UK we should take a firm stance in differentiating between the two. People should have the right to free speech and to disagree, but on the other side, we should clamp down very hard on anything that is just outright intimidation.
Nikki, you mentioned a little bit earlier on about the Ukraine war, and obviously so much support going there. Some people may think, I mean, we've had texts this morning suggesting, this is really convenient for Russia, isn't it? Everything that's happening now between Hamas and Israel, does that play into Russia's hands? I mean, there's also an element as well. I mean, Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, told us this morning that 2 Royal Navy ships are going over to the region to help with surveillance and security. You just wonder as much as anything about how thinly stretched the UK military could be, and also the wider context when you're thinking about the US.
Yes, I mean, I think I have some sympathy with those who've texted or messaged in. I think it's always right to ask who benefits from what has happened, and somebody had to obviously assist in getting, or countries had to assist in getting the weapons into to Gaza in order for there to be the concentrated missile strikes that there were, and the training and everything else. I mean, the fact is that it won't just be the UK military obviously offering support. As we know already, there's been an international coalition helping to support the Ukrainian government, and that will be the case now in terms of obviously offering counsel and, as you say, some sort of surveillance support to the Israeli government as well. But I mean, this is going to be, yes, I mean, we're living in an increasingly unstable world where there'll be more and more call on military resources. And so inevitably governments will have to focus on that, and there'll be other things that or problems that don't get done, or they get pushed down a priority list. But the point is, I suppose, for a government, the defence departments will be focused on this, and what can other government departments be doing to tackle other necessary long-term problems, so that focus isn't lost entirely. But I mean, it's one of those things that just shows we're going to come on, perhaps talk about, the changing nature of taxation or elsewhere in the UK, and you still have to find the money. Even when you think that the world has perhaps become a bit more stable, you still have to invest in your defence forces, because you just never know what is around the corner.